My name is Vivienne, and I am 30 years old. Last week at a high-end steakhouse in Manhattan, my father stood up, raised a vintage crystal glass, and toasted my sister's boyfriend for his unparalleled trajectory in private equity. He called Liam the son he always wanted. Then his eyes flicked to my husband Elias, who was sitting quietly in a polo shirt he had bought on sale. My father's voice dropped into that rehearsed, cutting pity he uses for people he considers beneath him. He looked at the other guests and said it is nice to have Vivienne's friend Elias here too, because it is important to have someone stable to hold the coats while the rest of us move the world. The table erupted in laughter. My mother swirled her wine like she had just heard a world-class punchline. I swallowed the bile in my throat and gripped my husband's hand. What my father did not know was that Elias had spent the last 6 months in a high-security war room at the very firm my father was desperately trying to court. For 3 years, they pushed me to leave him because he was not ambitious enough. They introduced him as my friend to avoid the embarrassment of having a first-generation analyst in the family. But the hierarchy of that room was about to be obliterated because the announcement was going company-wide tomorrow. My husband was about to become their favorite Golden Boy's direct boss. Before I tell you how I watched their entire world collapse, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories, but only if you genuinely connect with what I am sharing. Drop your age and your local time in the comments. I want to know who is listening. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the West Village townhouse where the architecture of my erasure first began. The crystal clinked under the dim lights of that Manhattan steakhouse, but the sound felt like a needle against my skin. My father, Julian, was in rare form. He loves a stage, and tonight the stage was a celebration of Liam's recent promotion. Liam is 27, wears tailored Zegna suits, and speaks in the vocabulary of old money that my parents find intoxicating. Throughout the entire first course, my mother Catherine kept leaning over me to pat Liam's hand, telling him how proud she was of his drive. I sat there in a dress I had found at a consignment shop, feeling the familiar weight of being the family utility. Whenever the conversation turned toward Elias, my mother would quickly redirect it, as if mentioning my husband's career was a social gaffe. When the waiter brought the main course, Julian finally acknowledged Elias, but only to ask if he could help the restaurant staff with the wine bucket, since Elias looked so comfortable in a supporting role. My father laughed, and the rest of the table followed his lead. They saw Elias as a downgrade because he did not lead with his resume. To them, he was just a 30-year-old analyst who did not care for the performance of wealth. I looked at Elias expecting to see the flicker of hurt I felt in my own chest, but his expression was a closed book. He was observing them with a professional patience that I finally understood was not passivity. He was collecting data. He knew that Liam's firm was currently being audited for redundancy, and he was the one holding the red pen. The tension at the table was thick, but it was one-sided. My parents were enjoying the sport of making us feel small, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was already shifting. Liam was boasting about his unparalleled trajectory, claiming he was the architect of a new restructuring plan. Elias just took a slow sip of water and met my eyes. In that look, I saw the truth. The man my parents were treating like a coat checker was actually the man who was about to decide if Liam even had a desk to go to on Monday morning. The conflict was no longer just about a mean-spirited toast at a dinner table. It was about the survival of the family's entire financial identity, and they were walking blindly into a trap they had set for themselves. Each time my father made a joke at Elias's expense, he was just adding another line to the receipt Elias was about to hand him. My mother told me earlier that day that I should be grateful Liam was even willing to be seen with us. She said that Elias lacked the breeding to move in these circles, and that I was dragging the family reputation into the mud by staying with him. She told me to stay in the background and not to hover around the important guests. As I sat there watching them celebrate a man who was essentially a paper tiger, I realized that I was done being the invisible daughter. I was waiting for the moment the masks would slip, and I knew it was coming sooner than any of them could imagine. The West Village townhouse where I grew up was a monument to the things my parents valued most. Mainly status-curated aesthetics and the constant performance of success. In that house, every square inch of crown molding and every antique rug served a purpose in maintaining the image of the perfect New York family. For 3 years, however, there was one word that was strictly forbidden within those walls, and that word was Elias. My parents had perfected the art of strategic erasure, treating my husband as if he were a temporary lapse in my judgment, rather than the man I had chosen to build a life with. To my mother, Catherine, and my father, Julian, a person did not truly exist unless they came with a verifiable pedigree or a title that looked impressive on a gala seating chart. Since Elias did not spend his weekends bragging about his portfolio or dropping the names of Ivy League deans, they simply decided to rewrite him out of our family history. Every December, when the holiday cards were sent out to hundreds of their associates, I would see the subtle ways they tried to hide my reality. They would list my sister Chloe's latest achievements in bold font, but when it came to me, they would mention my roommate or my long-term acquaintance. They could not bring themselves to use the word husband because it would imply a permanent connection to someone they considered a downgrade. Chloe was the family golden child, the living embodiment of everything Julian and Catherine wanted to project to the world. Her life was a meticulously managed gallery of high-status wins, from her private school honors to her prestigious associations. She moved through the house like a princess in a sanctuary, her bedroom filled with designer furniture and light that seemed to follow her every move. In contrast, the architecture of our home was a constant reminder of where I stood in their hierarchy. My room was the utility space above the garage, a cramped area that lacked the polished elegance of the rest of the townhouse. It was a room they only seemed to remember when they needed someone to house sit or watch the dog while they jetted off to a resort with Chloe and Liam. Growing up in the shadow of a golden child teaches you to become invisible, but it also gives you a vantage point that the performers never have. While they were busy admiring their own reflections, I was learning how to identify the rotten studs behind the fresh paint of their lives. The breaking point for our relationship came when Elias and me decided to get married. We did not want a spectacle or a performance for a room full of people who only cared about the price of the centerpieces. We chose a quiet courthouse ceremony, a private promise made in the heart of the city. When I told my mother the date, she did not offer a hug or even a forced congratulations. Instead, she checked her leather-bound social calendar and claimed she had a scheduling conflict. She told me that a family of our standing could not be expected to drop everything for a city hall appointment that lacked any sense of occasion. I found out later that her conflict was actually a gallery opening for Liam's distant cousin, an event she attended purely to stay in the good graces of the family Liam was tethered to. My father was even worse, refusing to acknowledge the marriage at all, and continuing to introduce Elias as my friend whenever we were forced into the same room. They saw Elias as a downgrade because he did not lead with his resume or his bank balance. He was a 30-year-old analyst who found no value in the loud performance of wealth, which to my parents was the ultimate sin. What they failed to understand was that while they were busy polishing the image of their crumbling legacy, Elias was building a foundation they could not even imagine. My father's firm was struggling with liquidity issues that he was desperately trying to hide behind expensive dinners and vintage wine, while Elias was quietly becoming the most valuable asset at Vanguard Global. To Julian and Catherine, Elias was a boring technician who worked in a back office, a man who lacked the fire of Liam's private equity ambition. They spent 3 years pushing me to leave him, telling me that I was wasting my prime years on a man who would never move the world. My mother would take me aside at every brunch to ask if I was tired of playing house with an amateur. She would suggest that I move back into the townhouse and let them find me someone who actually mattered. She spoke about Liam as if he were a god, and about Elias as if he were a stain on the family upholstery. The tension between my reality and their fantasy was reaching a boiling point. Every time we visited, the insults became more direct and the erasure more aggressive. They would set the table for a family dinner and purposely leave a chair for Elias in the kitchen or near the coat rack, claiming they ran out of room in the dining area. They would talk over him as if he were a ghost, discussing Liam's future as if it were the only one that mattered. Chloe would join in showing off the designer bags Liam bought her while making comments about the modest apartment Elias and me rented in Brooklyn. She called it a starter home for people who had already given up. I watched Elias during those moments, waiting for him to snap or to defend himself, but he never gave them the satisfaction. He would just offer a small knowing smile and continue his meal, his focus already miles ahead of their petty games. He knew something they didn't. He knew that Liam's firm was currently being evaluated for a hostile takeover, and he was the one who had written the proposal. One evening, about a week before the gala, I caught my father in his study, surrounded by past due notices he thought he had hidden. He looked up at me with a mixture of shame and fury, immediately trying to cover the papers with a silver tray. He told me that everything was fine, and that Liam was going to help him secure a massive investment that would fix everything. He looked at me and said that it was a shame my husband didn't have the connections Liam had, because maybe then I would be worth something to the family. He told me to stop looking for cracks in the foundation and to start being a supportive daughter for once. I didn't tell him that Liam's connections were a house of cards. I didn't tell him that the man he was counting on to save him was actually the one who was about to lose his job. The conflict was no longer just about their snobbery or the way they treated Elias as an invisible friend. It was about the fact that they were trusting their survival to a fraud while insulting the only person who could actually save them. The final insult came when my mother suggested that Elias should not even attend the upcoming corporate events because his presence might confuse the important people Julian was trying to impress. She told me that it would be better for everyone if I showed up alone so people would think I was still available for a better match. She actually had the nerve to say that Elias would probably be more comfortable staying home and watching TV anyway, since the high-stakes world of New York finance was clearly out of his league. I felt a cold, sharp clarity in that moment. I realized that my parents didn't just dislike Elias, they were terrified of what he represented. He was proof that you didn't need their permission or their pedigree to succeed. He was the only thing in my life that was real, and they were trying to turn him into a ghost. I looked at the West Village townhouse one last time as I walked out that night, realizing it was nothing more than a theater for people who were afraid of the dark. The stage was set for a disaster they had spent years building, and I was no longer interested in playing my part in their script. A new, much more dangerous conflict was brewing, and it was about to go company-wide. The West Village townhouse remained the primary theater for my mother's favorite weapon, which was the concept of background. To Catherine, a person's worth was determined entirely by the zip codes of their ancestors and the legacy of the summer homes they inherited. At every Sunday brunch, she would transform the dining room into a battlefield of passive-aggressive comparisons. These invitations were never born of a desire to see me. They were purely functional. I was the emergency childcare for Chloe's neurotic labradoodle, summoned only when the professional walker was unavailable. As I sat at the edge of the table, usually with a leash wrapped around my wrist, I would listen to my mother rhapsodize about Liam's family estate in the Hamptons. She spoke about his lineage as if it were a holy text describing the shingle-style architecture and the private beach access with a reverence she never once directed at my own life. Then she would turn her gaze toward Elias and exhale a long, performative sigh. She would point out that Elias was a first-generation success, a term that in her vocabulary translated directly to not quite our kind. Catherine had a unique talent for making a compliment feel like a surgical strike. She would lean across the expensive floral centerpiece and ask Elias about his little tech project, using a tone usually reserved for a child explaining a Lego tower. She made it sound like he was playing at a career, rather than excelling in one. The reality was that Elias held 2 groundbreaking patents in predictive logistics work that was currently being integrated into the global supply chains of several Fortune 500 companies. He was a man of immense intellectual depth and quiet power, but in my mother's eyes, he lacked the vintage charm of Liam's trust fund. Whenever Elias attempted to discuss the complexities of his work or the scalability of his recent software deployment, my father would abruptly interrupt him. Julian would wait for a pause in the conversation just to ask if Elias could head up to the guest room to look at the Wi-Fi router. To my father, a man who worked with computers was simply a glorified repairman, a technician whose only value was ensuring the family's entertainment systems remained functional. We were the invisible branch of the family tree, a part of the lineage they hoped would remain in the permanent shade so that Chloe's sunlight was never blocked. My sister would sit there draped in cashmere discussing the gala season and the yachting trips Liam had planned, while Elias and me were treated like the help that had accidentally been allowed to sit at the table. My parents had a specific vision for their legacy, and it involved Chloe marrying into the kind of established wealth that Liam represented. Elias was an obstacle to that vision, a reminder that the world was changing in ways they didn't understand and couldn't control. My mother once told me that the problem with first-generation people is that they are too hungry, too loud in their ambition, and that they lack the grace of those who have had money for a century. She said this while looking directly at Elias, who was quietly eating his omelet, seemingly oblivious to the insult. For a long time, Elias's professional patience frustrated me. I wanted him to stand up and list his achievements. I wanted him to pull up his bank statements and his patent filings and shove them in my father's face. I wanted him to tell my sister that her designer lifestyle was being funded by a man whose firm was currently bleeding cash. But Elias never took the bait. He would just offer a polite nod, answer my father's tech questions with a straight face, and continue his meal. It took me 2 years to realize that he wasn't being passive or intimidated. He was conducting an environmental assessment. Every brunch was an opportunity to observe the true state of my father's business dealings. He listened to the way Julian talked about the Milford project. He noted the increasing desperation in Liam's voice when he discussed quarterly returns. Elias was collecting data, building a psychological and financial profile of the people who thought they were his superiors. The conflict escalated during a particularly rainy Sunday in April. My mother had decided that the theme of the brunch would be legacy investments. She spent 20 minutes bragging about Liam's family donating a wing to a library in Connecticut, then looked at me and asked what Elias and me were doing for the community. Before I could answer, Chloe chimed in with a laugh, saying that Elias was probably still trying to figure out how to pay off his student loans. Liam joined in, making a joke about how the tech bubble was always one bad algorithm away from bursting. My father looked at Elias and said that if he ever wanted to learn how real business worked, the kind involving brick and mortar and actual land, he should come by the office and shadow Liam for a day. He called it a learning opportunity for the uninitiated. Elias didn't flinch. He just thanked my father for the offer and noted that the Milford site had some interesting zoning challenges. The look that crossed Julian's face was one of pure, unadulterated shock, followed quickly by a flash of anger. Julian demanded to know how Elias knew anything about the zoning in Milford. Elias simply said that he kept an eye on local development as a hobby. It was a lie, of course. Elias knew about the zoning because he was currently in the process of drafting a report that would devalue the entire Milford project by 30%. But he played it off as a casual interest, a little tech guy looking at maps. My father dismissed it, telling Elias to stick to his coding and leave the land development to the professionals. He told Liam that Elias was a perfect example of why you don't hire analysts to do the work of visionaries. My mother smoothed her napkin and said that at least Elias was useful for the Wi-Fi. The humiliation was becoming a ritual, a mandatory part of every family interaction. They needed me to feel small so they could feel grand, and they used Elias as the whetstone to sharpen their cruelty. As we walked back to our car that afternoon, I was shaking with suppressed rage. I told Elias that I couldn't do it anymore, that I wasn't going to let them treat him like a household appliance. Elias stopped me near the car, his hands steady on my shoulders. He told me to look at the house, to really look at it. He pointed out the peeling paint on the window frames and the slight sag in the porch roof. He said that the West Village townhouse was a masterpiece of theater, but the actors were starting to forget their lines. He told me that my father wasn't angry because Elias was wrong about the zoning. He was angry because he was right. The data was showing a collapse that Julian couldn't hide forever. Elias wasn't just a husband standing by my side. He was a silent predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He told me that the next time they called us to watch the dog or fix the Wi-Fi, I should say yes with a smile. He said that the more they underestimated him, the easier it would be to finish the job. I knew conflict was beginning to emerge within the family circle. My parents were starting to rely more heavily on Liam for financial advice, effectively handing him the keys to the kingdom. Liam was using this influence to push Elias further to the margins, suggesting that our presence at important holiday events might be a distraction for the high-level investors my father was courting. My sister was already acting like she was the mistress of the house, giving me instructions on how to handle the labradoodle's medication as if I were a hired hand. The architecture of my erasure was almost complete, and they were celebrating their victory prematurely. They had no idea that the invisible branch was about to become the only part of the tree left standing. The gala was approaching, and with it a company-wide shift that would turn their favorite son-in-law into a redundant casualty. Elias had finished his war room strategy, and the first phase of the Vanguard acquisition was already in motion. The next time we sat at a family dinner, the seating chart would be the least of their worries. The air in the West Village townhouse had become a pressurized chamber of expectation and vanity. About 3 months ago, the high-stakes summit invitation that Julian had spent a decade chasing finally materialized. The Vanguard Global Partners Gala is not just a party, it is the primary gatekeeper for the New York financial elite. For my father, securing a seat at that table was the ultimate goal because it represented the gateway to the $500 million pension fund he desperately wanted to manage. This was the deal that would erase his liquidity issues and restore the Lawson name to its former glory. Liam had been acting as the middleman, constantly whispering in my parents' ears about how he was pulling strings through his connections at the firm to get Julian on the list. Catherine and Julian were already celebrating the win, as if the investment check were already signed and deposited. They treated Liam like a conquering hero while Elias and me remained the invisible bystanders at their celebratory dinners. The atmosphere shifted on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when a private courier arrived at our modest apartment in Brooklyn. This was not a standard mailing. It was a hand-delivered gold-embossed envelope sent via a security firm. To my parents' absolute shock, a separate invitation had been issued specifically for me and Elias. When my mother saw the card sitting on our kitchen counter during one of her unannounced inspections, her first reaction was not curiosity or pride. She laughed, a sharp and dismissive sound that echoed off the walls. She looked at the gold lettering and told me that Vanguard must have made a clerical error with the address. Catherine suggested that I was probably meant to be in the volunteer check-in area, perhaps to help with the coat check, or to manage the registration desk for the actual guests. She could not conceive of a world where Elias and me were invited as partners rather than subordinates. I looked at the invitation and then at Elias, who was sitting at the dining table quietly reviewing a complex non-disclosure agreement on his laptop. He did not look up, and he certainly did not correct her. Elias has a specific way of moving through the world where he allows people to stay wrong about him until the exact moment their ignorance becomes a liability. He simply told my mother that he would make sure to wear a suit that did not embarrass the family photo. My mother patted his shoulder with a condescending smile, telling him that a clean, rented tuxedo would be perfectly fine for someone in the support staff. She was so blinded by the glare of Liam's supposed influence that she could not see the actual power sitting right in front of her. She left our apartment that day feeling triumphant, convinced that her golden son-in-law was the one who had orchestrated the entire evening. The conflict escalated as the date of the gala approached. My father began treating the event like his own personal coronation. He spent thousands of dollars on a new tuxedo and insisted that Chloe wear a custom gown to ensure the Harringtons were sufficiently impressed. He spent his mornings practicing his pitch in front of the hallway mirror, discussing global equity and the Milford Project with a confidence that felt increasingly brittle. Liam was feeding this fire, claiming that he had secured a private 10-minute meeting with Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Vanguard. Every time I tried to mention that Elias and me would be attending the main dinner, Julian would wave me off. He told me that while it was nice that the volunteers got to see the ballroom, I should stay out of the way of the real players. He warned me not to approach Liam during the event because Liam would be focused on high-level networking and didn't need the distraction of his underachieving sister. Liam's arrogance was reaching a peak that was almost theatrical. He started giving Elias advice on how to behave in a professional environment, suggesting that Elias should try to listen more than he spoke, so he wouldn't accidentally say something that revealed his unambitious background. He offered to lend Elias one of his older watches, so Elias wouldn't look completely out of place near the bar. I watched Elias during these interactions, waiting for the mask to slip. Instead, Elias would just nod and thank Liam for the guidance, his eyes fixed on the financial news ticker on his phone. Elias knew that the strings Liam was claiming to pull were actually being cut. The firm Liam worked for was currently being dismantled by a Vanguard acquisition team, and the private meeting Liam promised my father did not exist on Marcus Thorne's calendar. A new and sharper conflict emerged the night before the gala. My father called a family strategy session, which was really just an hour of Julian and Liam discussing how they would dominate the conversation at table 4. Julian looked at me and Elias and said that since we were volunteers, we should arrive an hour early to help the event coordinators with the seating charts. He told us that our primary job was to make sure the family looked unified and successful from a distance. He actually handed Elias a small flashlight and told him it might be useful for helping people find their seats in the dark. The level of humiliation was no longer subtle. It was a deliberate attempt to put us in our place before the biggest night of their lives. Elias took the flashlight and put it in his pocket without a word. He looked at my father and promised that he would make sure everyone ended up exactly where they belonged. I could see the desperation behind Julian's eyes even as he boasted about his future. He was betting everything on this gala, using his last remaining credit lines to fund the appearance of wealth. He believed that once he was at that table, the $500 million fund would be his. He saw the invitation as a life raft, unaware that he was the one who had punched holes in the bottom of the boat by underestimating his own family. My mother was busy instructing me on how to handle the social media posts for Chloe, telling me that I should take photos of Chloe and Liam from the sidelines and post them as if I were a fan. She told me that it was my chance to be part of something great, even if it was just as a spectator. The architecture of my erasure was being finalized in the West Village townhouse, and they were ready to unveil it to the rest of Manhattan. Elias and me left that meeting in a silence that felt heavy with the coming storm. As we walked toward the subway, I asked him why he was letting them do this. Why let them think we were the help? Elias stopped under a street lamp and looked at me with a cold, professional clarity that I had only seen in his office. He told me that in high-stakes acquisitions, the most dangerous person is the one the room has already dismissed. He said that Julian and Liam were so focused on the performance of power that they had neglected the actual mechanics of it. He told me that by tomorrow night, my father would realize that the table he was fighting for was already owned by the man he had given a flashlight to. The conflict was no longer about hurt feelings or family brunch. It was a corporate execution disguised as a gala. The final conflict of the week occurred when Liam tried to rescind our invitations entirely. He called me that night and said that there had been a change in the guest list and that the volunteer spots were full. He suggested that it would be better if Elias and me stayed home so we didn't accidentally embarrass Julian during the meeting with Marcus Thorne. He had the nerve to say that he was doing us a favor by sparing us the awkwardness of being in a room where we clearly didn't belong. I didn't get angry. I just looked at Elias, who gave me a sharp nod. I told Liam that we would be there regardless, even if we had to stand in the back. Liam laughed and told me not to be surprised if the security didn't recognize our names. He hung up, convinced that he had successfully purged the invisible branch from his big night. They had no idea that our names were not on the volunteer list. They were on the executive list. As I prepared for the evening, I thought about the 47 calls I had made to my father that went unanswered over the years. I thought about the master's degree graduation they skipped, and the way they had introduced Elias as a friend for 3 years. The weight of that neglect was about to be returned to them in a single company-wide announcement. The gala was not just a gateway for Julian, it was a finish line for us. The ground was shifting in ways that the logic of American society usually reserves for movies, but this was real. The man who had been told to hold the coats was about to become the man who decided who got to wear one. The next 24 hours would dismantle the Lawson reputation brick by brick, and it started with a gold-embossed card that my mother thought was a mistake. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed into a fortress of old money and new power, the limestone steps swarming with a sea of black ties and floor-length gowns that cost more than a suburban mortgage. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the frantic energy of people who spend their entire lives trying to be seen. My parents arrived with Chloe and Liam in a hired black car, moving with the practiced grace of people who believed they finally belonged. Liam looked every bit the golden sun in a tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. His chest puffed out as he offered his arm to Chloe. My sister was a vision in a custom silk gown, her jewelry catching the camera flashes of the few photographers stationed near the red carpet. I arrived with Elias in a simple black dress I had found at an outlet mall, a garment that was elegant, but lacked the loud branding my mother used as a social compass. The moment Catherine spotted me, her expression shifted from a practiced social smile to a sharp, narrowed look of irritation. She did not greet me with a hug or even a nod of acknowledgement. Instead, she stepped away from her circle of friends and pulled me toward the service entrance near the side of the grand hall. "Since you are here, you should at least be useful," my mother hissed, her voice a low vibration of disapproval. She did not look at Elias. She looked through him, treating my husband as if he were an inanimate piece of luggage I had brought along to clutter up her evening. She shoved her heavy beaded clutch into my hands and then produced a folded piece of paper from her wristlet. "This is a list of Liam's dietary restrictions for the caterer," she said, her finger tapping the paper for emphasis. "He cannot have shellfish or anything with pine nuts, and the kitchen staff needs to be reminded that his steak must be medium rare." She told me to stay near the coat check or the service corridor and warned me not to hover around the Harringtons or the CEOs. Catherine informed me that they had told everyone I was helping with the logistics tonight, a clever way to explain my presence without having to admit that I was a guest. To them, I was the staff member they were ashamed to share blood with, a failure who was only allowed in the building because of Liam's supposed influence and the clerical error of an invitation. I stood there holding her bag and the list of Liam's food preferences, watching my family walk toward the grand staircase where the real party was beginning. I was the invisible variable, the daughter relegated to the shadows so the golden sister could shine without distraction. The irony was palpable. While my mother was busy assigning me the role of a personal assistant, Elias was standing beside me with his phone vibrating in his pocket, receiving security clearance updates for the VIP lounge. He did not say a word to her. He did not defend me or reveal that he had a reserved seat at the head table. He simply waited until she was out of earshot, before taking the clutch and the dietary list from my hands. He looked at the paper and then tossed it into a nearby trash bin with a flick of his wrist. Elias met my eyes and told me that the only logistics I needed to worry about tonight was where I wanted to sit when the music stopped. The conflict escalated as I tried to navigate the service corridor. A floor manager with a headset stopped me, assuming I was a freelance coordinator because of my mother's instruction. He handed me a stack of seating placards and told me to start checking the name tags at the secondary tables. I felt the familiar sting of being managed, of being placed exactly where my parents felt I belonged. I looked up and saw Chloe on the mezzanine, laughing with a group of socialites and pointing down at the floor. She was likely telling them some version of the lie our mother had concocted, turning my life into a cautionary tale of what happens when you marry for love instead of leverage. My father was already cornering a junior analyst from a rival firm, trying to gather intel on Marcus Thorne's arrival. The desperation in his movements was visible from across the hall, a frantic search for a lifeline that was currently standing right next to the coat check. Elias stepped into the light, then his posture changing as he saw a member of the Vanguard security team approaching. The guard did not ask for a ticket or a volunteer badge. He checked Elias's biometric data on a tablet and then stepped aside, holding the velvet rope open with a level of respect usually reserved for heads of state. Elias reached for my hand, pulling me out of the service lane and back toward the main artery of the event. He told me that the performance was over and that it was time to move into the war room. I felt the gaze of my mother from across the room, her eyes widening as she saw me moving toward the restricted executive area instead of the coat check. She started to walk toward us, her face a mask of mounting fury, but she was stopped by a line of guards who informed her that the lounge was for partners only. The look on her face was worth every second of the 3 years I spent being called a downgrade. However, a new and much more dangerous conflict was unfolding. My father had seen me moving with Elias and was now trying to force his way past the security checkpoint, claiming that he was the father of the person they were letting in. He was making a scene, his voice rising in a way that was starting to draw the attention of the very investors he was trying to impress. He was shouting that there had been a mistake and that Elias was just a guest of the family. The security team was not amused. They were trained to handle high-level threats, and a middle-aged man in a rented tuxedo shouting about his daughter was a distraction they were authorized to neutralize. I watched as Liam tried to intervene, his own face pale as he realized that the security guards were ignoring his firm's credentials. Liam was realizing that his strings did not reach this far into the Vanguard infrastructure. The tension in the grand hall was reaching a breaking point. My mother was frantically trying to catch my eye, signaling me to come back and fix the situation before my father was escorted out. She was mouthing the word selfish at me, her hands gesturing toward the service entrance, as if I were a dog that had slipped its leash. She truly believed that my job was to sacrifice my dignity to save my father from his own arrogance. Elias leaned in and whispered that the CEO was 5 minutes away and that the board was expecting a status report on the acquisitions. He asked me if I wanted to handle my parents now, or if I wanted to let the house of cards fall on its own. I looked at my father, who was now being firmly told to lower his voice or leave the premises. And then I looked at Elias. I realized that for the first time in my life, I did not have to be the one who held the coats or fixed the Wi-Fi. What my family did not understand was that they had invited a wolf into their curated garden. Elias had spent months documenting the unethical shortcuts Liam's firm had taken to inflate the Milford project's value. He had the receipts for every lie and every hidden debt Julian had accumulated. They had spent years treating Elias like he was a nobody, never suspecting that the nobody was the one who was currently deciding the fate of their entire legacy. As the doors to the executive lounge opened, I saw Marcus Thorne standing at the bar, his attention fixed on a dossier that Elias had prepared. My mother was still at the velvet rope, her beaded clutch forgotten on a nearby table, her world narrowing down to the realization that her invisible daughter was the only one in the room with real access. The conflict was no longer a private family matter. It was a public dismantling of the Lawson reputation. Liam was trying to pull Chloe away from the scene, but she was frozen, her eyes fixed on Elias as he walked toward the CEO. The golden child was finally seeing the man she had mocked as a roommate, and the reality was shattering her carefully managed facade. My father was finally silent, his hands dropping to his sides as the security team formed a wall between him and the executive suite. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw something other than pity in his eyes. I saw fear. He realized that the daughter he had told to be useful was about to be the one who decided if he was even relevant. We walked into the lounge, the sound of the grand hall fading into a muffled hum behind the heavy oak doors. Elias didn't look back. He didn't gloat or wave. He just moved with the decisive rhythm of a man who had already won. I looked at the executive seating chart on the screen and saw our names at the top of the list. We were not there to help with the logistics. We were the logistics. The unexpected payoff was coming, and it was going to be much more absolute than a simple promotion. The next hour would dismantle 16 years of lies, and it would happen with the cool American cinematic logic of a corporate execution. My parents had told everyone I was helping with the logistics, and in a way they were right. I was helping to move them right out of the building. The grand oak doors of the executive lounge settled into their frames with a heavy, expensive thud, effectively muting the desperate shouts of my father and the frantic signaling of my mother. Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different from the chaotic performance in the grand hall. The air was cool, smelling of aged scotch and leather, and the conversation was low, precise, and focused on the movement of billions. What my family could not conceive in their wildest status-obsessed dreams was that Elias had never been intended for the coat check area. He had been headhunted by Vanguard Global 6 months prior, not as a mid-level analyst, but to lead their newly minted disruptive acquisitions division. For 90 days, while my mother was busy mocking his little tech project, and my father was asking him to fix the Wi-Fi, Elias had been meticulously restructuring the very private equity firm where Liam worked. The unparalleled trajectory that Liam had been bragging about all evening was actually just a single line on a high-security spreadsheet Elias was currently reviewing under the heading of redundancy. As I walked beside Elias, I watched the room react to him. These were the titans of the industry, men and women who didn't blink at 9-figure deals, and they treated my husband with a level of deference that made my head spin. They didn't see an unambitious friend or a first-generation downgrade. They saw the shadow boss, the man who had been brought in to trim the fat from a bloated market. Elias moved through the lounge with a quiet, lethal efficiency, nodding to the chief legal officer and sharing a brief coded exchange with the head of global risk. I realized then that Elias had been playing a much longer game than I had even suspected. He wasn't just working a job, he was executing a vision. He had chosen to remain invisible to my family, not because he was intimidated, but because their ignorance provided him with the perfect cover to observe their financial house of cards without interference. Across the room, through the glass partitions that separated the elite from the aspirants, I could see my father. Julian was still standing near the velvet rope, his face flushed desperately, trying to catch the eye of Marcus Thorne. He looked small and frantic, his rented tuxedo straining at the shoulders as he tried to project an authority he no longer possessed. He was a man who had built his entire identity on being an insider, yet he was currently being treated like a trespasser at the very gates he had spent a decade trying to storm. He had no idea that the man currently whispering in the ear of the CEO was the same man he had handed a flashlight to only 24 hours ago. The conflict had shifted from a petty family squabble into a full-scale battle for the survival of the Lawson family's entire financial identity. My father was looking for a lifeline, unaware that Elias was the one holding the scissors. Marcus Thorne turned away from a group of investors and headed straight for us, his hand extended and a genuine smile breaking across his weathered face. He didn't just shake Elias's hand, he clapped him on the shoulder like a trusted lieutenant. Marcus looked at me and noted that he had heard a great deal about my patience and my own professional achievements in urban planning. A detail my parents had never bothered to learn. He told me that Vanguard valued the steady partners behind the scenes just as much as the ones on the front lines. In that moment, the contrast between the way this billionaire viewed me and the way my own mother viewed me was devastating. To Catherine, I was a logistical assistant who needed to be useful. To Marcus Thorne, I was the partner of the man who was currently saving his firm's quarterly margins. A new and more intense conflict began to brew as Marcus pulled Elias toward a corner table where several dossiers were laid out. He told Elias that the final audit for the Fairfield acquisition, Liam's primary project, had flagged some significant irregularities. Marcus was not a man who tolerated ambiguity. He asked Elias for a direct recommendation on whether to proceed with the acquisition or to trigger the liquidation clause. This was the moment of peak leverage. If Elias triggered the clause, Liam's firm would collapse overnight, and my father's primary investment would be wiped out. Julian was still watching us through the glass, his eyes wide and pleading, realizing that his fate was being discussed in a room he couldn't enter. He started tapping on the glass, a move so gauche and desperate that even the security guards looked embarrassed for him. Elias didn't look at the glass. He opened the dossier and began to walk Marcus through the data points he had been collecting for months. He pointed out the inflated property values and the hidden debts that Liam had tried to bury in offshore accounts. He spoke with a clinical detachment that was more terrifying than anger. He was not seeking revenge, he was performing an autopsy on a dying business. He told Marcus that the firm was a liability, and that Liam's unparalleled trajectory was built on a foundation of accounting tricks and social climbing. The tension in the lounge was palpable as the board members leaned in, realizing that a major player was about to be removed from the board. My father's frantic tapping stopped as a lead security officer finally escorted him away from the glass, his exit marked by a silence that felt more final than a shout. The weight of the situation started to settle on me. I realized that Elias wasn't just deciding Liam's career. He was deciding where my parents would live next year. If the firm collapsed, the home equity loans Julian had taken out to support Liam's lifestyle would be called in immediately. The West Village townhouse, the antique rugs, the curated image of Lawson's success, all of it was tied to the decision Elias was making in this corner. I looked at my husband and saw the man who had been introduced as a friend for 3 years. I saw the analyst who had been told to stay in the background. He looked up from the dossier and met my eyes, and for a split second, the professional mask slipped. He asked me without saying a word if I was ready for what came next. I nodded, realizing that the architecture of my erasure was being replaced by the architecture of their consequences. The conflict escalated further when my sister Chloe somehow managed to slip past the first layer of security and was now visible at the lounge entrance, her custom gown wrinkled and her face a mess of tears and fury. She was shouting my name, accusing me of sabotaging Liam's career out of jealousy. She claimed that I was using Elias to get back at her for being the favorite, and she demanded that I come out and fix the mess I had made. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. The sister who had spent her life cropping me out of her world was now demanding that I be her savior. She was stopped by the guards before she could reach us, but her voice carried through the quiet lounge, a shrill reminder of the toxic dynamic that had brought us to this point. Marcus Thorne looked at the door and then at Elias, a single eyebrow raised in question. Elias didn't apologize for the disruption. He simply closed the dossier and told Marcus that the data spoke for itself. He recommended the immediate activation of the redundancy protocols and the termination of the partnership with Liam's firm. It was a corporate execution, clean and absolute. Marcus nodded and signaled to his legal team to begin the paperwork. The surprising ending of the night was not just the promotion, but the fact that Elias had already drafted the termination letters. He had known this moment was coming for weeks. He turned to me and said that the shadow boss was going into the light now. He asked me if I wanted to be there when the announcement was made to the rest of the gala. As we prepared to leave the lounge and head back into the grand hall, I realized that the survival of the family's financial identity was no longer an uncertainty. It was over. The man who had been mocked for his unambitious background had just dismantled a legacy in under an hour. We walked toward the doors, and I felt a strange sense of grief for the family I never really had mixed with a fierce pride for the man walking beside me. The grand hall was waiting, and the announcement was already being uploaded to the company-wide server. By the time we reached the mezzanine, every phone in the room would be vibrating with the news that Liam was redundant, and Elias was the new power in the building. The conflict was no longer about a dinner table. It was about the fact that the Lawsons were about to discover what it felt like to be truly invisible. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of architectural vanity, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast a sharp clinical light over the 300 guests, now settling into their assigned places. As the formal dinner commenced, the air grew heavy with the sound of silver against china and the low, self-important hum of New York's financial elite. My parents, Julian and Catherine, had been directed to Table 4. In the social geography of this room, Table 4 was prestigious, a sign that Julian was still considered a player in the game, but it was not the head table. It was close enough to see the power, but not close enough to touch it. Julian sat with his back straight, his eyes constantly darting toward the center of the room where Marcus Thorne was holding court. Beside him, Liam was already deep into his second glass of expensive wine, boasting loudly to a group of junior partners about a restructuring plan his firm was undergoing. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he was the architect of the future, completely unaware that he was actually the primary target of the very demolition he was describing. Chloe was leaning into Liam, her face radiating the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had finally secured her place at the summit. She kept glancing back at the service entrance, likely expecting to see me and Elias carrying trays or helping people with their coats. My mother was busy adjusting her pearls, whispering to a neighbor about the incredible influence Liam had within the Vanguard network. They were basking in a reflected glow that was about to be extinguished. When the head waiter, a man who moved with the silent precision of a Swiss watch, approached me, and Elias, he didn't point toward the back of the room. He bowed slightly and gestured toward the two empty gold-backed chairs at the head table directly to the right of Marcus Thorne. The movement was subtle, but in a room where everyone is a professional observer of status, it was a lightning strike. My father actually stood up from his seat at table 4, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that cut through the conversation like a blade. Julian did not wait for an explanation. He moved to intervene, his face a mask of authoritative arrogance. He stepped into the path of the floor manager, his voice carrying that sharp, condescending tone he had used to manage my life for 30 years. He told the manager that there had been a mistake. He pointed at Elias and me, and stated quite clearly that his daughter and her guest were supposed to be at the service table, or perhaps the volunteer station. He said with a short, jagged laugh that you cannot put a tech support guy next to the CEO of a $10 billion company. Julian was so blinded by his own script of my failure that he didn't notice the room had gone suddenly physically quiet. Marcus Thorne turned around slowly, his champagne glass frozen mid-air. He looked at my father, then at the floor manager, and finally at Elias. The silence stretched until it was uncomfortable, a held breath shared by 300 witnesses. The layers of family pride that Julian had spent decades polishing were about to be stripped away in a single public moment of truth. My mother had also stood up, her face pale, sensing that the theater was failing, but not yet understanding why. She tried to reach for me, signaling with a frantic hand for me to just go to the back before I embarrassed the family further. She whispered that I was being selfish, and that this night was too important for Julian's career to be ruined by my husband's lack of awareness. Marcus Thorne spoke then, and his voice was not the booming roar of a titan, but a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the entire ballroom. He asked my father if there was a problem with the seating. Julian, misinterpreting the question as a shared grievance between men of status, nodded vigorously. He told Marcus that these two were just helping out with the logistics and that they must have gotten confused by the gold leaf on the place cards. He actually reached out to grab Elias's arm, intending to steer him toward the exit. Elias didn't pull away. He simply stood there, his expression as calm and unreadable as a frozen lake. He looked at Marcus and noted that Julian was concerned about the integrity of the head table. The look Marcus Thorne gave my father was one of genuine clinical curiosity, the way a scientist might look at a particularly confusing specimen. He asked my father quite pointedly why he thought a senior partner of Vanguard Global and the lead architect of their acquisitions division belonged at a service table. The words landed like a physical blow. I watched the realization move across my father's face, a slow-motion collapse of every assumption he had ever made about the man I married. He looked at Elias's suit, really looked at it this time, and realized it wasn't a rental. He looked at the way the other partners were watching him, and he saw the pity he had usually reserved for us now being reflected back at him. Catherine's wineglass tilted in her hand, a dark red stain spreading across the white lace of her sleeve, but she didn't even notice. The conflict was no longer a private family matter. It was a high-stakes corporate execution. Chloe had gone from smug to horrified, her hands flying to her mouth as she realized the man she had called a roommate was the one holding Liam's career in his hands. Liam himself looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. He knew better than anyone what a senior partner at Vanguard could do to a firm like his. The room remained silent, waiting for the next move. Julian tried to stammer out an apology, his voice cracking as he attempted to pivot from arrogance to sycophancy. He told Marcus that he had no idea and that Elias was so humble he never mentioned his achievements. It was a pathetic lie, a desperate attempt to stay relevant in a world that had just moved past him. Elias finally spoke, his voice cool and stripped of any emotion. He told Julian that he had mentioned his work many times, but usually Julian was too focused on the Wi-Fi or the coat check to listen. He thanked my father for his concern, but suggested that Julian should return to table 4 before his dinner got cold. It was a dismissal so absolute that it made the earlier toast in the steakhouse look like a minor slight. My father sat down, his movement robotic and stiff, while the rest of the table watched him with the quiet disdain reserved for those who have made a terminal social error. Catherine sat beside him, her face a mask of frozen horror, realizing that the family reputation she had built on Liam's borrowed status had just been incinerated in front of the entire industry. However, a new and sharper conflict was immediately suggested by the way Elias looked at the seating chart on his phone. He leaned into Marcus and mentioned that since the restructuring was moving ahead of schedule, they should probably address the liquidity issues at the sub-firms tonight. He looked over at Liam, who was currently trying to hide behind a floral arrangement. The unparalleled trajectory was officially over. Liam was no longer the golden son. He was a liability that Elias was about to liquidate. I realized that Elias wasn't done. He wasn't satisfied with just a seat at the table. He was going to dismantle the entire network that had kept me invisible for 16 years. Chloe stood up, then her custom gown rustling as she tried to make her way toward the head table, ignoring the security guards. She was shouting that this wasn't fair, and that Elias was being cruel on purpose. She was trying to force an emotional confrontation in a room where only data mattered. She was making a scene that was further cementing the Lawson family as an unstable element. My mother tried to pull her back, but the damage was done. The string quartet began to play, a desperate attempt by the event coordinators to restore a sense of order, but the melody felt like a funeral march for my family's social standing. I looked at Elias as he finally took his seat next to Marcus Thorne. He looked like he belonged there not because of a title or a pedigree, but because he was the only person in the room who wasn't pretending. He reached for his water glass and met my eyes. He asked me with a slight tilt of his head if I was ready for the announcement. I realized that the dinner was just the beginning. The company-wide email was about to hit every phone in the room, and when it did, the name Liam would be replaced by the word redundant. The unexpected payoff was not just the seat at the table, it was the fact that the man who had been told to hold the coats was now the man who owned the house. My father had spent a decade trying to get a seat at this table, and now he was going to spend the rest of his life remembering the night he tried to kick his own son-in-law out of it. The silence that descended upon the ballroom was not merely a lack of noise, but a heavy physical presence that seemed to drain the color from the air. Marcus Thorne did not spare a single glance for my father Julian, whose hand was still extended in a clumsy gesture toward the service exit. Instead, the most powerful man in the room looked directly at Elias and extended his hand with a warmth that was entirely absent for anyone else. Marcus told Elias that he had been wondering when he would finally make it through the crowd because the board had just been discussing the Fairfield acquisition Elias had finalized earlier that morning. My father's hand began to shake, the fingers that had so confidently labeled my husband as a tech support guy now twitching against the backdrop of his expensive tuxedo. My mother Catherine stood frozen, her social smile a brittle mask of confusion that was starting to crack under the weight of a reality she could not compute. The man she had spent 3 years calling an unambitious friend was revealed to be the architect of the very deal my father had spent his entire professional life trying to understand. Marcus Thorne then turned his gaze toward Julian, his eyes shifting from warm recognition to a cold clinical professionalism. He looked at my father as if he were a smudge on a window pane and asked a question that was only 3 words long but carried the weight of a death sentence. "And you are?" It was the exact same invisible treatment my father had pioneered on me for decades, the strategic erasure of a person's existence based on their perceived lack of utility. Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was a man who lived for the introduction, for the moment he could announce his name and watch people scramble for their business cards, yet here he was being asked for his identity by the gatekeeper of his dreams. The conflict was no longer about a seating mistake. It was the total psychological dismantling of my father's ego in front of 300 people who mattered. Catherine tried to step in her voice, a thin, wavering thread of its usual authoritative silk. She told Marcus that they were Vivienne's parents, and that there had clearly been a massive misunderstanding about Elias's role. She actually tried to laugh a dry, rattling sound that made the nearby socialites look away in embarrassment. She said that Elias was so modest about his work that they had simply assumed he was in a more junior position. Marcus didn't buy the lie. He didn't even acknowledge it. He kept his eyes on Julian, waiting for a response that my father was too stunned to give. The hierarchy of the room had been inverted, and the Lawsons were suddenly at the bottom of a very deep pit. Elias remained the calmest person in the room. He didn't gloat, and he didn't even look at me for validation. He simply stood there, his presence radiating a quiet authority that made Liam look like a child in a costume. Elias told Marcus that Julian was a local branch manager who was very interested in the Fairfield project. He said it with a clinical detachment that made the title sound like an insult. He was returning the favor of 3 years of being called a friend by reducing my father to a footnote in a corporate report. Julian's face went from pale to a deep bruised purple as the realization hit him that his son-in-law wasn't just successful. He was the one who had just made the Milford project redundant. A new and more aggressive conflict ignited when my sister Chloe tried to storm the head table. She had witnessed the exchange from table 4 and was now vibrating with a mixture of terror and fury. She pushed past a waiter nearly knocking over a tray of crystal flutes and demanded to know why Elias was lying to these people. She shouted that Elias was just an analyst and that Liam was the one who actually worked at Vanguard. She was trying to protect the house of cards that was her life, unaware that the wind had already blown it over. Marcus Thorne looked at Chloe with a mixture of disdain and boredom and asked security to manage the disruption. He told the guards that he didn't want the dinner ruined by uninvited outbursts. Chloe screamed that she wasn't an outburst, she was a Lawson. She pointed at me and said that I was the one who had planned this to ruin Liam's big night. She was making a scene that was being recorded by at least a dozen smartphones, her custom gown and carefully styled hair, now just the costume of a woman, having a public breakdown. My mother grabbed Chloe's arm, trying to pull her back, but the damage to the family's reputation was absolute. They had come to this gala to be crowned, and they were leaving as a cautionary tale. The social capital Catherine had spent decades accumulating was evaporating in real time, replaced by the hushed whispers of the very people she had spent her life trying to impress. The conflict escalated further when Liam stood up, his face white and his breathing shallow. He looked at Elias and asked in a voice that was barely a whisper if the redundancy list had been signed. Liam knew that his firm was built on the Fairfield deal and that without it, they were insolvent. Elias didn't look at him with pity. He looked at him as a line item. Elias told him that the board had made the decision based on the data and that the official notices would be sent out at midnight. He suggested that Liam should probably use the rest of the evening to update his resume rather than drinking the firm's remaining assets. It was a cold American cinematic execution of a career delivered with the precision of a surgeon. Liam sat back down, his eyes glazed, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. He had promised my parents a world he didn't own, and Elias had just foreclosed on it. Chloe was still being held back by security, her protests turning into quiet, jagged sobs. My father looked at the head table, at the gold-backed chairs, and at the man he had mocked as a downgrade. He realized that the seat he had spent 10 years trying to get was occupied by someone he had tried to erase. The unexpected payoff was not just the promotion or the status, it was the fact that the Lawsons were now the invisible ones. Marcus Thorne signaled for the first course to be served, effectively ending the confrontation and signaling to the room that the Lawson family was no longer a topic of conversation. The string quartet began to play a brighter piece, the music a cruel contrast to the silent funeral happening at table 4. My mother sat back down, her hands shaking so hard she had to hide them in her lap. She looked at me, and for the first time there was no instruction in her gaze, no demand for me to be useful. There was only the realization that I was no longer under her control. However, a new and even more devastating conflict was suggested by the arrival of a second courier at the head table. This one wasn't carrying an invitation. He was carrying a legal folder for Elias. Elias opened it, reviewed the contents, and then leaned in to Marcus. He mentioned that the home equity loans tied to the Milford project had been cross-referenced with the Vanguard acquisition. He looked over at Julian, and I saw a flicker of something new in Elias's eyes. It wasn't just professional, it was personal. He told Marcus that they should probably execute the lien on the West Village townhouse tomorrow morning to settle the outstanding firm debts. I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. This wasn't just about a job or a dinner. This was about the house I grew up in. This was about the very walls that had seen my erasure. Elias was deciding whether to take away the roof over my parents' heads. He looked at me, the folder still open, and asked if I had any final thoughts on the Lawson estate. I realized that the man I married was no longer the quiet analyst I had protected. He was the one holding the keys to every single thing my parents owned. The next part of the night was going to be the most intense conflict yet, because the price of their humiliation was about to become a literal invoice for their home. Elias spoke up, then his voice cutting through the heavy tension of the ballroom with a calm that was stripped of the frantic performance every other person in the room was currently putting on. He looked at Marcus Thorne, and then back at my father Julian, who was still standing with his mouth half open, a man whose social armor had been pierced by a single question. Elias noted that this was Julian, my wife's father, and then he added with a slight clinical tilt of his head that Julian was in the hardware industry. He said he believed Julian managed a branch in Milford. The words were delivered with a cool precision that landed like a physical blow. Elias was using my father's own repackaged lies against him, taking the very euphemisms Julian had used to inflate his status and turning them into a cage. For years, Julian had told the Harringtons and his country club associates that he was a titan in the hardware industry to hide the fact that he actually managed a struggling commercial branch that was hemorrhaging cash. By using that specific phrasing in front of Marcus Thorne, Elias reduced the self-proclaimed real estate mogul to a mid-level manager of a hardware store in the eyes of the global elite. Julian's face went the color of the white linen tablecloth, a pale, sickly gray that signaled the total collapse of his public persona. He tried to speak to perhaps correct the record or reinflate his importance, but the words died in his throat. He was trapped by his own fiction. If he admitted he wasn't just a hardware manager, he would have to explain the massive debts and the failing Milford project that Elias was currently auditing. Across the room at table 4, Chloe looked like she had been slapped. Her golden life, the one she had meticulously curated through Instagram filters and Ivy League name-dropping, was suddenly being eclipsed by the sister she had spent years cropping out of photos. She was watching her status evaporate in real time, realized that the man she had called a roommate was the one who now held the keys to her social survival. The realization hit the room like a physical weight. The power had shifted irrevocably, and the daughter they had labeled a disgrace was now the gatekeeper of the only world they wanted to inhabit. Catherine sat beside my father, her hands gripping her evening bag so hard that her knuckles were white. She looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years, there was no instruction in her eyes. There was no demand for me to be useful or a lecture on how I was embarrassing the family. There was only a raw, naked fear. She was realizing that the daughter she had relegated to the service entrance was the only reason she was still allowed to sit in the ballroom. She tried to catch my eye, her lips moving in a silent plea, but I didn't look back. I was too busy watching Elias, who had returned his attention to Marcus Thorne, as if my parents had already been removed from the board. To the titans at the head table, my father was no longer a person. He was a footnote in a disaster report. The conflict escalated when a prominent investor from a rival firm leaned in toward Julian. He had overheard the exchange and asked with a sharp predatory curiosity if the Milford branch was the one currently facing a municipal lien. It was a shark sensing blood in the water. My father tried to offer a rehearsed answer about expansion and strategic pivots, but the investor just laughed and turned back to Marcus, effectively erasing Julian from the conversation. The social death was happening in stages, each one more agonizing than the last. My mother tried to stand up, perhaps to pull Julian away, or to attempt one last desperate social maneuver, but her legs seemed to give out, and she sank back into her chair, her mask of perfection completely shattered. Chloe was not going down quietly. She stood up at table 4 and shouted that Elias was being cruel on purpose. She told the surrounding guests that our family had supported me for years, and that this was how I was paying them back. She was trying to frame the situation as a personal vendetta, a narrative of a bitter sister attacking the golden child. But the room wasn't interested in family drama. They were interested in the data Elias was holding. One of the Vanguard partners looked at Chloe and told her that outbursts were not a substitute for financial solvency. He suggested that if she wanted to help her family, she should start by learning how to read a balance sheet. The humiliation was absolute. The loss in name, which my mother had spent decades polishing into a shield of respectability, was now being treated as a punchline. Liam looked like he wanted to vanish. He had been the one who promised my parents that Elias was a nobody. He had been the one who insisted that he had the strings to get Julian to the head table. Now he was sitting at a table where people were actively moving their chairs away from him. He realized that Elias hadn't just gotten a promotion, he had conducted a professional execution of every person who had ever told me I was a downgrade. Liam looked at Elias and asked if there was any chance for a private meeting on Monday. Elias didn't even look up from his dinner. He simply noted that his Monday was full of liquidation hearings. It was a final cold American cinematic moment that signaled the end of Liam's career. A new and more personal conflict emerged when my father finally found his voice. He didn't use it to apologize. He used it to attack. He leaned over the table and told me that I was a traitor to my own blood. He said that after everything they had given me, the house, the education, the name, I was standing by and watching my husband destroy them. He told me that I would regret this when I was alone, and that Elias would eventually treat me the same way he was treating them. It was a desperate, ugly attempt to sow doubt, the last weapon of a man who has lost everything else. I looked at my father, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I didn't feel the need to explain that the house was a utility space, and the education was something they skipped the graduation for. I just told him that Elias wasn't destroying them. He was just showing everyone who they actually were. The tension at the table was suffocating. My mother started to cry, not the quiet, graceful tears she used for effect, but the jagged, ugly sobs of a woman who has realized the theater is over. She looked at Marcus Thorne and tried to beg for another chance for Julian, but Marcus just signaled the waiter to bring the next course, his attention already elsewhere. The Lawsons were officially a distraction that had been managed. The unexpected payoff was not just the status or the money, it was the silence. For 30 years, my life had been filled with the noise of their expectations and the volume of their insults. Now there was only the quiet professional hum of a room that had already decided I was the one who mattered. However, the conflict was about to take a turn that none of us expected. As the main course was served, a security detail entered the ballroom, moving toward table 4 with a level of purpose that made the entire room stop eating. They didn't go to my father. They went to Liam. They told him that there were concerns regarding the handling of several accounts at his firm and that he was required to leave the premises immediately for questioning. The corporate audit Elias had triggered was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. My sister Chloe screamed as the guards took Liam's arm, her custom gown catching on the edge of the table and tearing as she tried to follow him. The public dismantling was complete. I looked at Elias, whose expression hadn't changed once during the entire scene. He reached for his champagne glass and offered a small private toast to me. He asked if I was ready for the final announcement of the evening. I realized that the dinner was just the setup for the real blow. The company-wide email had been the first wave, but the second wave was a legal move that would ensure the Lawsons never had a seat at any table in this city again. My father looked at the security guards taking Liam away, and then he looked at Elias. He realized that the man he had called a friend was the one who had not only taken his seat, but was currently taking his legacy. The next part of the night would be a total role reversal, as the daughter they had told to hold the coats was about to be the only person who could decide if they even had a coat to wear. The morning after this gala did not bring the usual New York sunrise of golden light and quiet promise. Instead, it arrived with the cold, clinical glow of thousands of smartphone screens lighting up simultaneously across the tri-state area. While my parents were still reeling in their West Village townhouse, nursing the twin hangovers of expensive scotch and total social annihilation, the internal Vanguard Global announcement went company-wide at precisely 8 a.m. The subject line was simple, but its contents were a wrecking ball to the Lawson family legacy. Elias Thorne Vance was officially appointed as the senior partner of Global Acquisitions. This was not just a promotion or a new title to be printed on a business card. The email included a detailed attachment listing the subsidiary firms now falling under his direct jurisdictional control. Right there near the top of the list was the boutique private equity firm where Liam had been playing at being a high flyer. Liam's unparalleled trajectory had not just slowed down, it had hit a reinforced concrete wall named Elias. I sat at my kitchen table in Brooklyn, watching the digital ripple effect in real time. My father's phone, which he had left on the mahogany sideboard in his hallway, did not stop buzzing with urgent notifications. These were not the congratulatory messages he had envisioned 24 hours ago. They were calls from the regional bank informing him that his primary credit line, the one keeping the Milford project from drowning in debt, was being flagged for immediate review. The department conducting that review was the very one Elias now headed. For 3 years, Julian and Catherine had pushed me to leave my husband because he was not ambitious enough. They had called him a downgrade and a first-generation mistake because he didn't care for the performance of their world. Now the man they had introduced as a friend held their entire lifestyle, their home, and their future in his hands. The conflict escalated within minutes of the announcement hitting the public wire. My father called my personal cell phone 17 times before I finally picked up. His voice was no longer the booming, arrogant baritone that had commanded the Steakhouse. It was a jagged, desperate rasp. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize for the night before. He demanded to know if I had seen the news and if Elias was really the one behind the credit freeze. He told me that this was a family matter and that I needed to tell my husband to stand down before the bank started seizing assets. I looked at Elias, who was quietly drinking his coffee and reviewing a series of liquidation notices, and I realized that my father still didn't understand the man he was dealing with. Elias was not a variable to be managed. He was the solution to a problem my father had created through years of greed and superficiality. The tension in the townhouse reached a breaking point when my mother Catherine realized that the social circle she had spent decades cultivating was closing its doors. Her bridge club group chat had gone silent. The invitations for the fall charity circuit were being rescinded via polite automated emails from various assistants. The realization was setting in that being associated with the Lawsons was now a liability. Catherine was frantic, moving through the house and touching her antiques as if they might disappear if she let go of them. She called my sister Chloe, who was currently locked in her bedroom, refused to speak to anyone after Liam had been escorted from the gala for questioning. The golden life they had all shared was being dismantled by a single professional decree. A new and more visceral conflict emerged when my father decided to drive to the Vanguard headquarters, thinking he could bypass security and confront Elias in person. He believed that his status as a father-in-law would still carry weight in a corporate lobby. He arrived at the Glass and Steel Tower in Midtown, demanding to see the senior partner. He was met not by a welcoming committee, but by the same security detail that had managed the gala. They told him that he was not on the authorized visitor list, and that his presence was considered a disruption to firm operations. Julian started shouting about how he had built this city, and how Elias owed him everything for taking me off his hands. It was an ugly public meltdown that was captured by several bystanders on their phones. My father was finally becoming the very thing he feared most, a common spectacle. While my father was making a scene in Midtown, a different kind of authority was arriving at the West Village townhouse. My mother was in the parlor trying to reach a bankruptcy lawyer when the doorbell rang. She expected it to be a delivery, or perhaps a desperate Liam looking for shelter. Instead, she opened the door to find 4 uniformed officers and 2 plainclothes detectives. For a split second, her mind went to Liam. She assumed they were there to follow up on the irregularities at his firm, or to question Chloe about the offshore accounts. But the lead detective didn't ask for Isabella or Liam. He asked for Julian Lawson. The conflict had moved beyond corporate redundancies and into the realm of criminal negligence. The police were there to investigate a series of fraudulent home equity loans tied to the Milford Project loans that had used forged signatures and misrepresented assets. The look on my mother's face as the police entered the house was one of total, unadulterated collapse. She tried to tell them that there had been a mistake and that the Lawsons were a respected family. She pointed to the photos of Chloe's graduation and the museum plaques on the wall as if they were shields against the law. The detectives were not impressed. They had a warrant for the office records and a subpoena for my father's personal ledgers. They were moving through her curated sanctuary with the same clinical efficiency Elias had used at the gala. Catherine realized then that the invisible daughter wasn't the only threat to her world. The truth was finally catching up to the theater she had spent a lifetime directing. I heard about the raid from Elias, who received a notification from the Vanguard legal team. He told me that the audit had uncovered more than just mismanagement. It had uncovered a decade of systemic fraud that my father had used to maintain the appearance of wealth. Liam hadn't just been a bad manager, he had been my father's accomplice, a young man who was willing to cut corners to gain the approval of a man he considered a mentor. They had built a legacy on a foundation of lies, and Elias was the one who had finally pulled the thread that made the whole thing unravel. I felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. The people who had told me I was a downgrade were currently being exposed as the true failures. The conflict intensified further when Chloe finally emerged from her room, only to see the police carrying boxes of her father's files out to a waiting van. She didn't go to her mother. She didn't try to help. She turned on her mother, accusing her of knowing about the fraud and lying to her about Liam's career. She screamed that her life was ruined and that she would never be able to show her face in the Hamptons again. The golden child was lashing out at the woman who had created her, a final ugly reversal of the family dynamic. Catherine sat on the velvet sofa, surrounded by the ruins of her reputation, and for the first time she looked her age. She looked like a woman who had bet everything on a lie and lost. The surprising ending of the morning was not the arrests or the raid. It was the fact that my father never made it home. He was intercepted by the police at the Vanguard lobby and taken directly to the precinct for booking. The man who had toasted Liam's unparalleled trajectory was now facing an unparalleled legal disaster. Elias looked at me across the kitchen table, his expression steady. He asked me if I wanted to go to the precinct, or if I wanted to go to the gallery we had planned to visit. He was giving me the choice. They never gave me the choice to prioritize my own life over their drama. I realized then that the revenge wasn't in the raid or the credit freeze. The revenge was in the fact that I no longer felt responsible for their survival. We spent the afternoon in Chelsea walking through quiet rooms filled with light and art, a world away from the chaos of the West Village. My phone buzzed occasionally with messages from my mother begging me to use Elias's influence to get Julian out of jail. She told me that family should stick together and that we were all they had left. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. The invisible daughter had finally stopped asking for a seat at their table, and in doing so, she had found a table of her own. The conflict was no longer about their insults or their neglect. It was about the fact that the Lawsons were discovering what it felt like to be truly alone. The next part of the story would involve a final devastating meeting at the townhouse, where the invoice for their lies would finally be delivered in full. The following Tuesday, the West Village townhouse was not filled with the usual air of effortless superiority, but with a frantic and suffocating desperation. Suddenly, my mother had a lot to say, and the silence of the previous 3 years was replaced by a flurry of texts and voicemails that ranged from tearful to demanding. A family meeting was called for 7 p.m. sharp, the same kind of high-stakes summons they used to use to lecture me on my life choices, my modest career, and my supposed lack of vision. In the past, these meetings were where I was told to be more like Chloe, or to consider if Elias was really the best I could do. I showed up at the front door with my husband, but for the first time in our relationship, Elias was not playing the role of the quiet observer. He was wearing the $5,000 bespoke suit he usually reserved for Vanguard board meetings, the charcoal fabric cutting a silhouette that made the townhouse's grand entryway look small and dated. My mother Catherine opened the door with a hug that felt like a calculated business transaction. There was no genuine warmth in her touch, only the frantic clawing of a woman trying to attach herself to a rising star. She told me that I looked radiant, and then turned to Elias with a smile that was so bright it was grotesque. She exclaimed that they were just over the moon for us, and that she had always known Elias was special. This was the same woman who had called him free help and an unambitious downgrade just months ago. Now she was trying to act like his biggest cheerleader, her voice pitching up an octave as she ushered us into the dining room. I watched her hands tremble as she offered to take our coats, her movements devoid of the practiced elegance she had spent 60 years perfecting. We were led to the oval dining table, a massive piece of polished mahogany that had been the site of my most significant humiliations. For years, Elias had been relegated to the folding chair brought in from the basement, a piece of furniture that signaled his status as an auxiliary guest rather than a family member. Tonight, however, the folding chair was gone. Catherine had set the table with the heirloom Waterford crystal and the silver she usually saved for the Harringtons. She tried to seat Elias at the head of the table, but he ignored her gesture and pulled out a chair for me, first moving with a decisive rhythm that made my father Julian look like a ghost in his own home. We sat down and watched them sweat the heavy silence of the room, punctuated only by the sound of the air conditioning humming behind the walls. Julian sat across from us, his face a map of exhaustion and mounting panic. He was no longer the real estate mogul who moved the world. He was a man staring at the wreckage of a 10-year lie. He didn't look at Elias with the pity he had used at the Steakhouse. He looked at him with the naked hunger of a drowning man looking at a life raft. He cleared his throat and tried to start with a joke about corporate synergy, but the words fell flat on the table. My father realized that the person he had treated as a tech support guy was now the only person in the world who could stop the municipal liens from dismantling his firm. The conflict was no longer about family loyalty or background. It was a cold American cinematic confrontation between a predator and the prey that had finally turned around and bit back. The tension escalated when Catherine began a monologue about the importance of family unity during difficult times. She spoke about the Lawson legacy and how we had always looked out for one another conveniently, forgetting the 3 years she spent trying to erase my husband from the family tree. She told us that Chloe was devastated and that Liam was a victim of a corporate misunderstanding that Elias surely had the power to fix. She was trying to frame their criminal negligence and professional fraud as a series of unfortunate accidents that required a family bailout. Elias didn't interrupt her. He let her ramble until she ran out of breath, his eyes fixed on the silver spoon in front of him. When she finally stopped, the room went so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the pitcher on the sideboard. A new and more aggressive conflict was suggested by the way my father leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. He didn't offer an apology for the gala or the years of neglect. He told Elias that as a senior partner at Vanguard, he had a fiduciary responsibility to protect his family's interests. He actually had the nerve to say that Elias's promotion was a win for the whole Lawson brand, and that we should start discussing the capital injection needed for the Milford project immediately. He was still trying to manage the situation, still trying to dictate the terms of our existence, even as the police were cataloging his office files. Julian believed that because Elias was now successful, the previous insults were just part of the rough-and-tumble path to the top. Elias finally looked up, and the expression on his face was one of pure clinical boredom. He asked my father quite pointedly why he thought a Vanguard senior partner would invest in a project that had already been flagged for systemic fraud and municipal insolvency. The word fraud landed in the middle of the table like a live grenade. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her throat, while Julian's face went a dark, bruised shade of red. Elias noted that family unity was a two-way street that the Lawsons had spent a decade turning into a dead end. He told them that the only reason we were at this table was to witness the final accounting. The conflict intensified when Chloe burst into the dining room, her eyes red from crying and her voice shrill with a new kind of fury. She didn't go to her parents for comfort. She went to Elias, demanding that he use his influence to get the charges against Liam dropped. She claimed that Liam had only done what our father had told him to do, and that it wasn't fair for him to go to jail while Elias was being toasted at the Met. The golden child was finally seeing the rot behind her curated life, and she was looking for someone to blame. She accused me of poisoning Elias against them, and said that I had always been jealous of her relationship with Liam. She was making a scene in the very room where she had spent years mocking my modest apartment and my unambitious husband. Elias didn't respond to her outburst with anger. He simply produced a small digital recorder from his pocket and set it on the table. He asked Chloe if she remembered the phone call she had made to me the night before the gala, the one where she suggested Elias should stay home so he wouldn't embarrass the family near the bar. He hit play, and her own voice filled the dining room sharp and dismissive, describing Elias as a roommate who lacked the breeding to move in important circles. The look on Catherine's face as she heard her favorite daughter's words was a fracture in the porcelain of her life. The theater was over, and the receipts were being presented in full. A new conflict emerged as my father realized that Elias wasn't there to negotiate a bailout. He was there to perform an autopsy. Julian stood up his chair, falling backward with a loud crash against the hardwood floor. He told us to get out of his house and that he didn't need anything from a traitor and his puppet. He was retreating into a final, desperate arrogance, trying to reclaim the authority that had already evaporated. He told me that I was no longer a Lawson and that I should never come back to the West Village again. It was the same erasure he had practiced for 30 years, but this time it had no power over me. I looked at the man who had told me to hold the coats and realized I was no longer afraid of his voice. The surprising ending of the meeting was not the shouting or the recorder. It was the fact that Elias didn't leave when Julian told him to. He stayed seated, adjusted his cufflinks, and told my father that it was no longer Julian's house to kick people out of. He told them that as of 4 p.m. that afternoon, the Vanguard subsidiary had executed the primary lien on the property. He said that the townhouse was now firm property and that they were officially trespassing. The look of total, absolute shock that moved across my parents' faces was a satisfying payoff that made every missed graduation and misspelled holiday card worth it. They were losing the very stage they had used to humiliate us. We stood up to leave the silence of the room, now heavy with the reality of their homelessness. My mother was clutching the edge of the mahogany table as if she could anchor herself to the wood, her world narrowing down to the realization that she had no place to go. I looked at the oval table one last time, at the silver and the crystal that were no longer theirs, and I felt nothing but a clean, cold peace. The conflict was no longer about their insults or my invisibility. It was about the fact that the Lawsons were finally discovering what it felt like to be the guests who weren't wanted. The next part of the story would involve the final 60-day notice and the delivery of the 2-bedroom apartment in Jersey City, the ultimate role reversal for the people who had spent their lives looking down on everyone else. My father did not lead with a plea for forgiveness or even a simple apology for the decades of calculated silence he had forced upon me. Instead, he led with a spreadsheet. He smoothed the printed document onto the mahogany dining table, his fingers trembling slightly as he pushed it toward Elias. Julian looked my husband in the eye, attempting to summon the ghost of his old authority, and told him he would be blunt. He stated that the Milford project was underwater and that they required an immediate capital injection of $12 million to avoid a total foreclosure on the firm. He said it with a staggering sense of entitlement, as if the family blood he had spent years disowning was suddenly a binding legal contract that entitled him to a bailout. It was a performance of audacity that made my skin crawl. He wasn't looking for his daughter. He was looking for a venture capitalist who happened to be sitting in his dining room. Liam was sitting on the far end of the table, his usual arrogance replaced by a shattered, hollow expression. He looked at Elias with the desperation of a man who realized the ground had already vanished beneath his feet. Liam told Elias that if he signed off on the redundancies, Liam would be out of a job and blacklisted from every major firm in the city. He added that he and Chloe were supposed to close on their Manhattan penthouse next week, and that without his salary and the firm's stability, the deal would collapse. They were not asking for a restoration of the family dynamic or a chance to make amends for the insults they had hurled at us. They were asking for a checkbook. They wanted Elias to use his hard-earned power at Vanguard to sweep their fraud and mismanagement under the rug because it was convenient for their lifestyle. Catherine leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Elias, as if she could hypnotize him into compliance. She told him that as a senior partner, $12 million was surely just a rounding error for his department. She suggested that it was a small price to pay for family peace and the preservation of the Lawson reputation. My mother was attempting to turn her previous cruelty into a bargaining chip, implying that if Elias saved them, she would finally grant him the acceptance she had withheld for 3 years. She spoke about the penthouse as if it were a shared family victory rather than a monument to Chloe's vanity. To Catherine, the logic was simple. The daughter she had labeled a failure had accidentally acquired a high-value husband, and therefore that husband's assets now belonged to the collective. The conflict escalated when Elias did not reach for the spreadsheet. He didn't even look at the numbers Julian had painstakingly arranged. He looked at the antique clock on the mantel and noted that the foreclosure notice had already been drafted by the Vanguard legal team 2 hours ago. He told my father that $12 million was not a rounding error. It was a waste of shareholder capital on a terminal asset. Elias stated that he had a fiduciary duty to the board, and that duty did not include bailing out a man who had forged signatures on home equity loans. The room went silent, the air becoming so thin it felt like we were sitting at the top of a mountain. My father's entitlement shifted into a raw, ugly fury. Julian slammed his hand onto the table, rattling the crystal glasses Catherine had set out to impress us. He shouted that Elias owed him for the life he had given me and for the name I still carried. He told Elias that without the Lawson prestige, Elias would still be a nobody working in a back office. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim a hierarchy that had already been destroyed. He was trying to bully the man who held his entire future in a digital folder. Elias simply looked at him and asked if the Lawson prestige was the reason the municipal authorities were currently outside the Milford site with a padlocking order. My father's face went a sickly shade of gray, the realization hitting him that Elias knew every detail of his collapse. A new and more personal conflict emerged when Chloe turned her focus on me. She didn't look at her husband or her father. She looked at me with a hatred that was cold and sharp. She asked how I could sit there and watch my husband destroy her life. She told me that I had always been the jealous sister, the one who couldn't handle her beauty or her success, and that I was using Elias as a weapon because I was too weak to fight my own battles. She claimed that the only reason Elias was doing this was because I had poisoned his mind against them. The golden child was finally seeing the cracks in her own reflection, and she was determined to make me the villain in her story. Elias spoke up, then his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the entire room. He told Chloe that I had spent 3 years defending her to him despite the way she had treated me. He said that I was the only person in the house who had ever shown any genuine loyalty, and that the Lawsons had repaid that loyalty by trying to erase me. He looked at Liam and noted that the redundancies weren't personal. They were a professional necessity based on the fact that Liam's department had lost 40% of its value in 6 months. Elias was laying out the facts with the precision of a judge delivering a verdict. He told them that the bailout they were asking for was impossible, because the firm was already legally insolvent. The tension in the room reached a breaking point when my mother realized that her cheerleader act was not going to work. She dropped the facade of the proud mother-in-law and told me that I was a disgrace to the family name. She said that if I didn't make Elias sign the check, I was dead to her. She threatened to cut me out of the will and to ensure that no one in their social circle would ever speak to me again. It was a hollow threat considering they no longer had a social circle, and the will was currently being reviewed by a bankruptcy court. I looked at my mother and realized that she was still trying to use the same tools of shame and exclusion that had failed her at the gala. I told her that she couldn't cut me out of a life I had already left. Liam tried one last desperate maneuver. He got up from the table and walked over to Elias, attempting to lean in and speak to him man to man. He suggested that if Elias helped him cover the Fairfield irregularities, he would give Elias a 20% stake in the new venture he was planning. He was trying to bribe the man who was currently overseeing the investigation into his fraud. Elias didn't even stand up. He simply signaled to the 2 men who had been waiting in the hallway, men my parents had assumed were drivers, but were actually Vanguard security officers. He told Liam that the man-to-man conversation was over, and that the next people Liam would be talking to were the federal auditors. A new conflict was immediately suggested by the way my father looked at the silver and crystal on the table. He realized that the bailout was not coming, and that the house was truly lost. He started grabbing pieces of the silverware, shoving them into his pockets in a frantic, undignified scramble. He was a man who had built his life on the appearance of wealth, and now he was reduced to stealing his own heirlooms before the bank arrived. Catherine watched him in horror, the reality of their decline finally stripping away the last of her pride. The Lawson legacy was ending not with a grand toast, but with a middle-aged man hiding spoons in his tuxedo. The surprising ending of the meeting was not the refusal of the check, but the revelation Elias made as we stood up to leave. He told my father that he hadn't just denied the bailout, he had already purchased the debt of the townhouse personally. He said that the bank wasn't the one they had to worry about anymore. He was the landlord now. He told them that he would be issuing a formal 60-day notice to vacate in the morning. My parents stood there frozen in their own dining room, realizing that the man they had mocked was now the person who owned the roof over their heads. The final outcome was consistent with the cinematic logic of a total role reversal. The daughter who was told to hold the coats was now the one who owned the closet. We walked out of the townhouse for the last time, leaving them in the silence of a house that was no longer theirs. The next part of the story would involve the delivery of the manila folder and the final accounting of their neglect. I did not reach for the spreadsheet Julian had meticulously prepared. I did not care about his projected losses or the desperate math he was using to justify his survival. Instead, I reached for a manila folder I had been keeping in my bag for 3 years, a quiet archive of the erasure they thought I hadn't noticed. I told my father that I had a spreadsheet too as I slid a document across the polished mahogany table toward him. This page did not contain financial figures or interest rates. It was a chronological list of every instance they had used the labels friend, roommate, and long-term acquaintance to describe my husband. I showed them the tabulated data of our existence in their world. On one side of the ledger were the 215 missed calls they had made to my cell phone in the last 7 days, a frantic surge of interest born entirely of greed. On the other side was a 0, representing the number of calls they had made to Elias on his birthday for 3 consecutive years. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy physical weight that seemed to swallow the hum of the Manhattan streets outside. The ice in their crystal glasses had long since melted, leaving watered-down scotch, and a bitter aftertaste of a theater that had finally closed its doors. I looked at my mother and father and told them that they never saw a partner or a son-in-law. They saw an invisible variable they could control, a person they could sideline until they needed a service performed. I asked my father quite clearly if he really expected $12 million from the man he would not even let in the family photo. Julian's hand, which had been hovering over his own spreadsheet, dropped to the table like a dead weight. He looked at the list of insults, at the dates, and the specific quotes I had recorded, and for the first time he realized that the daughter he had dismissed as unobservant had been documenting his cruelty with the precision of a prosecutor. Catherine tried to reach for the folder, her fingers trembling, but I pulled it back. She began to stammer that those were just social shorthand, and that they didn't mean anything by them. She claimed that in their world you have to be careful about how you introduce people until they have proven their standing. It was a pathetic attempt to justify her snobbery as a form of social caution. I told her that Elias had proven his standing every day by building a life without their help, while they were busy proving their lack of character by trying to hide him. The conflict was no longer about a loan or a business deal. It was about the fact that I was finally presenting the invoice for 3 years of emotional neglect, and the price was their entire world. The tension escalated when my brother-in-law Liam tried to speak. He looked at the log of missed calls and tried to laugh it off, saying that everyone gets busy, and that Elias shouldn't be so sensitive about a few forgotten birthdays. Liam was still trying to play the role of the cool, high-status insider, unaware that his own status was currently being liquidated. Elias didn't even look at him. He simply noted that Liam's firm had spent $80,000 on a birthday party for a junior partner last month, while claiming they didn't have the budget to pay their own vendors. Elias was showing him that he didn't just have the personal receipts, he had the corporate ones too. He told Liam that sensitivity had nothing to do with it, but integrity had everything to do with it. A new and sharper conflict emerged when my sister Chloe realized that the manila folder contained more than just a list of labels. I turned the page to reveal a series of screenshots from her private group chats messages, where she had mocked my wedding dress and called our apartment a starter home for losers. I had been sent these by a mutual friend who was tired of Chloe's arrogance. I watched the color drain from Chloe's face as she saw her own words printed in black and white. She had spent years performing the role of the supportive sister while sharpening her knife behind my back. I told her that she wanted a penthouse paid for by the losers she spent her weekends laughing at. The golden child was finally being exposed as a hollow shell, her curated life built on the foundations of other people's pain. Julian tried to pivot back to the business, his voice a low, desperate growl. He told me to stop being dramatic and to remember where I came from. He said that the townhouse was my legacy too, and that if it went under, I would have nothing to show for my heritage. It was a desperate attempt to use my own history against me, a final hope that I was still invested in the Lawson name. I looked at the walls of the dining room, at the portraits and the silver, and realized that they were just props in a play I had stopped watching. I told my father that my legacy wasn't a house built on forged signatures and social climbing. My legacy was the man sitting next to me, the one who didn't need a name to be powerful. The conflict reached a boiling point when my mother realized the finality of the situation. She didn't offer a bailout for the firm. She offered a bailout for her own social standing. She begged me to at least tell the Harringtons that the gala incident was a joke and that Elias was the one who had made the mistake. She was still trying to manage the narrative, still trying to protect the theater, even as the stage was being dismantled. I told her that the Harringtons were currently reviewing Elias's report on Liam's firm and that they were much more interested in the data than her stories. Catherine sank back into her chair, the weight of her own vanity finally crushing her. A new conflict was suggested by a vibration on Elias's phone. He looked at the screen and then at Julian. He mentioned that the municipal authorities had just finished their preliminary walkthrough of the Milford site, and that the environmental violations alone would exceed $5 million. This wasn't just about debt anymore. It was about criminal negligence that could lead to prison time. My father's eyes went wide. his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned. He realized that Elias wasn't just refusing the money. He was providing the evidence that would ensure the firm could never be resurrected. The unexpected payoff was the clinical speed at which the Lawson empire was being erased. Liam stood up, his face a mask of frantic energy. He told us that he was going to call his lawyers and that we couldn't do this to them. He claimed that the Vanguard acquisition was a hostile act and that he would fight it in court. Elias didn't even stand up to face him. He simply noted that the court wouldn't be interested in his complaints once they saw the evidence of the offshore accounts Liam had been using to hide Julian's losses. The silence returned more absolute than before. Liam realized that every move he had made to hide the truth had been tracked by the man he had told to hold the coats. The surprising ending of the session was not the folder or the legal threats. It was the fact that I didn't feel the anger I expected. I felt a clean, cold clarity. I looked at the three people across from me and realized they were strangers who shared my DNA, but nothing of my soul. I stood up and told them that the family meeting was adjourned. I said that we were leaving and that the next time they saw us would be in a courtroom or a mediation suite. I told my mother that she should start packing the antiques she valued so much because the 60-day notice was already in the mail. As we walked toward the door, my father shouted one last time. He called me a disgrace and told me that I was dead to him. He was retreating into the only power he had left, the power of exclusion. I didn't turn around. I didn't flinch. I just walked out into the cool New York night, with the man who had seen me when I was invisible. The conflict was no longer about their neglect or my husband's promotion. It was about the fact that the Lawsons were finally discovering what it felt like to be the ones left behind. The next part of the story would involve the final 60-day countdown and the move to Jersey City, the ultimate role reversal for the people who thought they moved the world. Elias spoke then, and for the first time in the 3 years I had known him, he discarded the soft, patient mask he wore for my family and replaced it with the cold, authoritative steel of the Vanguard boardroom. He leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the mahogany table that had seen so many of my humiliations. He told my father that he had personally reviewed every line of the Milford project and that the numbers were a disaster. He stated clearly that the project was not underwater because of a shifting economy or bad luck. It was underwater because of Liam's unparalleled mismanagement. Elias looked Julian directly in the eye, his gaze steady and unforgiving. He told my father that he was not there to offer a capital injection or to save a dying firm. He was there to witness its foreclosure. The words fell like lead weights into the silence of the room. My father tried to sputter a protest about loyalty and legacy, but Elias cut him off with a single sharp gesture. Elias reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a document. It was not the $12 million check my parents were salivating for. It was a formal, notarized voluntary relinquishment of inheritance and ties. Elias slid the paper toward Julian and announced that we were officially resigning from this family. He looked at my mother, who was clutching her pearls as if they could provide oxygen, and told her that since they had spent years treating us like staff, they should understand that staff can quit. He said we were officially off the clock. Catherine's jaw dropped, her mouth a small, silent circle of horror, as the reputation she had spent 60 years building finally hit the floor. The woman who lived for the seating chart and the social column was watching her only connection to actual power walk out the door. The conflict escalated as the legal weight of the document settled over the room. Julian grabbed the paper, his eyes scanning the legalese with a frantic, desperate speed. He realized that by signing this, he was losing his only leverage. He told us that we were being ungrateful and that we were abandoning our blood in their hour of need. He accused Elias of being a corporate vulture who was picking over the bones of a family business. My father was shouting now, his voice cracking with the realization that his theater was truly over. He told me that I was a traitor to my ancestors and that I would never be allowed back into the West Village townhouse again. He was trying to banish someone who had already left. Catherine stood up, her face a mask of jagged, desperate lines. She didn't look at Elias. She looked at me and asked how I could let this happen. She told me that she had sacrificed everything to give me a respectable life and that I was throwing it away for a man who didn't even care about our history. She claimed that I was the one who was breaking the family conveniently, ignoring the thousands of times she had broken me. My mother was attempting to use the same tools of guilt and shame that had worked for 30 years, but they were no longer effective. I looked at her and realized that she wasn't a mother. She was a director who had lost her lead actress. I told her that she didn't sacrifice for me, she sacrificed me for Chloe. A new and sharper conflict emerged when Liam realized that his name was also mentioned in the relinquishment documents. Elias had included a clause that explicitly prohibited Liam or any of the Lawson associates from contacting Vanguard Global for a period of 10 years. Liam was not just losing his job, he was losing his career in New York finance. He stood up, his face white and his hands trembling, and told Elias that he would sue for interference with a contract. He claimed that the audit was a personal vendetta and that no court would uphold it. Elias didn't even blink. He simply noted that a court would be much more interested in the forged signatures Julian had used on the home equity loans. The threat of prison time was the new cold reality that replaced the bailout. Chloe began to scream, then a high, thin sound of pure terror. She turned on Liam, hitting him on the shoulder and accusing him of ruining her life. She told him that she was supposed to be a socialite and that now she was going to be the wife of a criminal. The golden child was lashing out at her own reflection, her curated life dissolving into an ugly public meltdown. She looked at me and begged me to tell Elias to stop. She promised to be a better sister and to never crop me out of a photo again. It was a pathetic, transparent lie born of panic. I looked at the sister who had told me my wedding was a city hall mistake and realized I didn't even feel pity for her. I just felt finished. Julian tried one last desperate move. He grabbed the silver pitcher from the sideboard and threatened to throw it through the window, claiming that if he was going down, he was taking the house with him. He was a man reduced to a tantrum in his own parlor. Elias didn't move to stop him. He simply noted that the house already belonged to Vanguard and that any damage would be added to the criminal restitution charges Julian was already facing. My father froze, the silver pitcher held mid-air, a ridiculous and broken figure in a rented tuxedo. He realized that even his rage was no longer his own. The tension in the room reached a boiling point when my mother realized that Elias wasn't just leaving, he was erasing them from our future. She looked at the Waterford crystal on the table and asked if she could at least keep the heirlooms. She was already bargaining for the scraps of her former life. Elias told her that everything in the house was currently part of the asset freeze and that she would need to talk to the court-appointed receiver. He was treating her with the same professional distance she had used when she introduced him as a friend. The role reversal was absolute, and the finality of it was a satisfying payoff for every year of invisibility. A new conflict was suggested by a knock at the front door. This wasn't a guest or a courier. It was the security team Elias had hired to begin the inventory of the property. They entered the townhouse with clipboards and cameras moving through the rooms, where I had grown up, as if they were a crime scene. My father sat down in his leather chair, the pitcher still in his hand, watching as strangers photographed his life for a liquidation sale. The theater was officially dark, and the actors were being escorted from the stage. The surprising ending of the evening was not the relinquishment, but the fact that Elias handed my mother a single small key. He told her it was for a storage unit in New Jersey, where he had moved the only things of mine that actually mattered to me. He said that since she valued property so much, she should understand that the only property he cared about was my peace of mind. Catherine looked at the key, a tiny piece of metal that represented her total loss of control, and she began to sob. She realized that the daughter she had relegated to the service entrance was the only one who had actually cared enough to protect anything. We walked out of the West Village townhouse for the last time, the sound of the front door closing behind us feeling like the final beat of a movie. I didn't look back at the limestone steps or the curated windows. I looked at Elias, who had guided me through the wreckage with a steady hand. He asked me if I was ready for the next part of our lives, the part where no one ever had to hold a coat for someone else again. I realized that the conflict was no longer about their neglect or our revenge. It was about the freedom of finally being no one's daughter. The next part of the story would involve the final 60-day move and the astonishing reveal of what Elias had truly been building in the shade. The astonishing blow came next, delivered with the clinical finality of a gavel hitting a marble bench. Elias stood up to leave, adjusting his charcoal jacket with a deliberate slow motion that commanded the sudden silence of the room. He looked at my father, who was still clutching a silver spoon, as if it were a weapon, and added that he did not just review the foreclosure paperwork. He told the room quite clearly that he had personally bought the debt. My father blinked, his eyes darting around the parlor as if the walls might already be moving. He whispered a single word, "What?" but his voice lacked the volume of his previous rages. Elias did not hesitate. He stated as a matter of fact that Vanguard, under his direct authorization, now owned the West Village townhouse, the commercial firm, and my parents' primary residence in the Hamptons. He informed them that the Lawson legacy was no longer a matter of public record, but a line item in his personal portfolio. The air in the room seemed to vanish. My mother, Catherine, let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob, her hand flying to the throat she had always adorned with pearls she no longer legally owned. Elias told them they would have exactly 60 days to vacate the premises. He noted that he had already authorized a modest 2-bedroom apartment for them in Jersey City, a location, he pointed out, was conveniently close to the PATH train. He used my father's own stability insult from the Steakhouse to define their new, reduced reality, suggesting that it was important for them to stay stable and mobile in this new phase of their lives. Julian did not speak. He did not shout or threaten or reach for the spreadsheet. He just stared at the mahogany table. He no longer owned his reflection in the polished wood, looking like a stranger he didn't recognize. The role reversal was absolute, and the logic of it was as cold and sharp as the New York winter. The conflict escalated as the sheer scale of the displacement began to sink in. Chloe stood up, her custom gown rustling like dead leaves in the silence. She demanded to know where she and Liam were supposed to go if the Hamptons house was gone. She reminded Elias that she was a Lawson and that she shouldn't have to live in a borough that didn't have a designer zip code. Elias looked at her with a level of boredom that was more devastating than anger. He told her that since she had spent so much time mocking our starter home in Brooklyn, she should find the Jersey City apartment quite spacious by comparison. He noted that Liam's severance package had been entirely diverted to settle the municipal liens Julian had incurred, leaving them with exactly $0 in their shared account. The golden child was finally being forced to breathe the same air as the people she had spent a lifetime looking down on. Catherine found her voice then, but it was no longer the voice of a socialite. It was the voice of a woman who had realized her theater was being demolished while she was still on stage. She begged Elias to at least let them keep the art collection, claiming that those pieces were part of her soul. She was attempting to bargain for the scraps of her vanity, unaware that Elias had already inventoried every frame. Elias told her that the soul of the house had been sold to cover the forged signatures Julian had used to fund her lifestyle. He said that the art would be auctioned off on Friday to settle the outstanding debts with the contractors Julian had cheated in Milford. The architectural erasure was complete, and the finality of it was a satisfying payoff for every year I spent being told I was a failure. A new and more visceral conflict emerged when Julian finally stood up, his legs shaking so hard he had to lean on the table for support. He didn't look at the silverware in his pocket. He looked at Elias and asked how he could be so heartless to his own family. He tried to claim that he had welcomed Elias into his home and given him a chance when no one else would. It was a staggering lie, a complete rewrite of the 3 years of introducing him as a friend and relegating him to the folding chair. Elias didn't even blink. He simply produced a small ledger from the manila folder and read out the dates and times Julian had asked him to fix the Wi-Fi instead of inviting him to the dinner table. He told my father that heartlessness was a skill he had learned by watching Julian Lawson for 36 months. Liam tried to intervene, suggesting that if Elias gave him a small consulting fee, he could help manage the transition of the assets. He was still trying to find a way to profit from the disaster, his parasitic nature, surviving even the collapse of the firm. Elias didn't even acknowledge his presence. He simply signaled to the security team to begin the physical lockdown of the executive study. He told Liam that the only thing he would be managing was his own legal defense against the fraud charges. The corporate execution was moving into the cleanup phase, and there was no room for consultants. Liam realized then that he was no longer the son they always wanted. He was a liability that was being liquidated. The tension in the townhouse reached a breaking point when the lead security officer handed Julian the formal eviction notice. It was a white envelope with the Vanguard seal, a document that represented the end of the Lawson name in the West Village. My mother began to wail, a high, jagged sound that echoed through the grand hallway, a sound that lacked any of the grace she had spent a lifetime perfecting. She was realizing that the people she had looked down on were the ones who now held the power to decide if she even had a bed to sleep in. The social geography of her world had been inverted, and Jersey City was her new capital. Elias turned to me and asked if I had seen enough. He was giving me the choice to stay and watch the final collapse or to walk out while the theater was still burning. I looked at the oval table, at the crystal and the silver, and realized that I didn't need to see them suffer to feel whole. I had already won the moment I stopped waiting for them to see me. I told Elias that I was ready to go home. We walked toward the grand entryway, the sound of our footsteps on the marble floor the only rhythm in the room. My mother tried to grab my arm as I passed her, fingers cold and desperate, but I stepped around her, moving with a decisive clarity that she had never allowed me to have before. A new conflict was suggested by the arrival of a moving truck at the curb. This wasn't for my parents. It was for the items Elias had purchased from the estate to ensure they never fell back into Julian's hands. Elias told the movers to begin with the piano in the parlor, the one Chloe had used to perform for the Harringtons, while I was told to stay in the garage. The instruments of their performance were being removed, leaving only the empty rooms and the realization of their own irrelevance. Julian stood on the limestone steps, watching as his world was loaded into a van, a man whose only legacy was a list of debts and a daughter who no longer recognized him. The surprising ending of the night was not the Jersey City apartment or the foreclosure. It was the fact that Elias handed the keys to the West Village townhouse to me. He told me that he didn't buy the house for the firm. He bought it for me to do with as I pleased. He said that since they had spent 30 years trying to make me invisible in this space, I should be the one who decided if the space even continued to exist. I looked at the heavy brass keys in my hand and realized that I didn't want the house. I didn't want the mahogany or the marble or the history of my own erasure. I told Elias that I wanted to sell it and use the proceeds to fund a scholarship for first-generation students in Brooklyn. I wanted to turn their monument to vanity into a gateway for people like us. We walked away from the townhouse, the cool New York air hitting my face like a promise. I didn't look back at the windows or the door. I looked at the man walking beside me, the one who had seen the foundation while everyone else was busy polishing the studs. The final outcome was entirely consistent with the logic of a world where value is earned, not inherited. My parents had told everyone I was a downgrade, and now they were discovering the true definition of the word. The next part of the story would involve the final 60-day move and the astonishing realization that the Lawson legacy wasn't just gone. It had been repurposed for the very people they had spent their lives ignoring. 6 months later, the relentless noise of the Manhattan social climb had been replaced by the quiet, rhythmic sound of the Hudson River below our new balcony. I sat there in the late afternoon sun, looking out at the skyline of a city that finally felt like it belonged to me, not as a background player or an invisible variable, but as someone who had claimed her own space. Our new home was a sanctuary of light and clean lines, a world away from the suffocating history of the West Village townhouse. In this new life, there were no utility rooms or garage apartments. There were no social calendars to manage or neurotic dogs to walk. There was only a profound crystalline peace that comes when you stop waiting for people to see you and finally decide to see yourself. The view from this height was different. The buildings didn't look like fortresses of power anymore. They looked like the achievements of people who, like Elias and me, had built their own foundations brick by brick. The social geography of the Lawson family had undergone a total and permanent shift. Chloe and Liam were currently living in a cramped rental in a part of Queens they had once mocked as the destination for people who had given up on life. Liam was no longer the golden son with the unparalleled trajectory. He was a junior clerk at a mid-sized insurance firm, a job he had only secured because the background check didn't look too closely at his previous redundancies. He spent his days answering phones and his nights listening to Chloe complain about the lack of a doorman. My sister, the woman who lived for custom gowns and high-status galas, was now working at a retail boutique where she had to assist the very socialites she used to consider her peers. The golden life she had curated was gone, replaced by the gritty daily reality of an entry-level existence in a city that does not care about your pedigree if you cannot pay the rent. My parents were settling into their new reality in Jersey City, a transition that had been as graceful as a car wreck. The two-bedroom apartment Elias had authorized was clean and functional, but to my mother, Catherine, it was a prison cell. She spent her days volunteering at a local community center, not out of a sudden surge of altruism, but simply because she needed someone to talk to who didn't know her history. She had become a ghost in the New York social circles she once commanded. Julian was no longer the man who moved the world. He was a man who spent his mornings at the library reading the financial news and trying to understand how a tech support guy had dismantled his empire. They were discovering that without the townhouse and the titles, they were just two people facing the consequences of a lifetime of superficiality. The conflict of the past had not entirely vanished, but it had changed its shape. About a week ago, a card arrived in our mail for Elias's birthday. It was a simple handwritten envelope from my mother. When I opened the outer layer, I saw that she had spelled his name correctly for the first time in 4 years. There were no euphemisms like friend or roommate inside. There was just a short note asking if we could meet for coffee sometime and an acknowledgement of his recent success. For a split second, I felt the old pull of family loyalty, the desire to reach back and offer them a seat at our table. I looked at the handwriting and realized it wasn't born of a change of heart, but a change of circumstances. They were still looking for a way back into the light, and they thought a correctly spelled name was the key. I didn't open the card further. I didn't show it to Elias or use it to start a conversation about forgiveness. I simply walked over to the desk in the hallway and placed it in a drawer with the other unopened messages they had sent over the last few months. I didn't do it out of hate or a desire for revenge. I did it because I no longer needed the receipt of their approval. The manila folder I had kept for 3 years was closed, and the ledger was balanced. The validation I had spent my entire life seeking from them had finally been found within the walls of my own home, and the partnership I had chosen. I realized that the greatest form of revenge wasn't the foreclosure or the move to Jersey City. It was my own indifference to their opinion. A new and much more satisfying conflict was playing out on the television in the background. The evening news was reporting on the opening of the Lawson Scholarship Fund in Brooklyn, the initiative I had started with the proceeds from the sale of the townhouse. The reporter was standing in front of a new community center, talking about how the space was designed to support first-generation students and neurodivergent learners. They mentioned that the fund was named in honor of the daughter who had seen the value in a community that others had ignored. I watched as a group of young students walked through the doors of the building that used to be a monument to my father's ego, and I felt a sense of closure that no bailout or apology could ever provide. I had repurposed their vanity into a gateway for the very people they had called downgrades. Elias walked out onto the balcony, then carrying 2 glasses of wine and a small plate of appetizers. He didn't ask about the mail or the family or the news. He just sat down beside me and looked out at the river. He looked like the same man I had married in that quiet courthouse ceremony, the analyst who didn't care for the performance of wealth. The only difference was that now the rest of the world saw what I had always known. He reached for my hand, his grip steady and warm, a silent anchor in a world that was always shifting. He told me that the final audit of the Lawson estate was complete, and that the accounts were officially closed. He said that we were finally free of the ledger. The tension of the city seemed to vibrate below us, but up here, the air was still. I thought about the steakhouse, the gala, and the dining room table where I had been told to be useful. I thought about the girl who had been told she was a roommate, and the man who had been told to hold the coats. We were no longer characters in their script. We were the authors of our own. The role reversal was not just about the money or the titles, it was about the fact that we were the only ones in the story who had stayed true to ourselves. The Lawsons were still performing for an empty theater, while we were finally living in the real world. The surprising ending of the story was not a final confrontation or a dramatic reconciliation. It was the quietness of the resolution. There was no big speech or a cinematic sunset. There was just a table set for two, where everyone was finally seen. I looked at Elias and realized that our life together was the only inheritance that mattered. We had built something that didn't require a pedigree or a social column to exist. We had built a table where honesty was the only currency, and where no one ever had to ask for a seat. As the sun dipped below the horizon, lighting up the glass towers of Manhattan in a final fiery orange, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey. The invisibility they had forced on me was the very thing that had allowed me to grow strong in the shade. The downgrades and the insults had been the fuel for a life they couldn't conceive. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, leaving the drawer full of their letters behind. The conflict was over. The theater was dark. The only thing left was the life we had chosen, and for the first time in 30 years, it was exactly enough. I realized that the real payoff wasn't the $47 million check or the senior partnership. It was the moment I stopped looking back at the West Village and started looking forward to the rest of my life. The final outcome was perfectly consistent with the logic of a world where value is determined by character, not by the names on a hospital wing. I turned off the lights in the hallway, the skyline of New York still shimmering through the windows like a promise kept. We sat down at our table, the one in front of me, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for permission to exist. I was already there. My name is Vivienne, and I am no longer the invisible daughter. I am the woman who owns the house, the woman who owns her story, and the woman who finally knows her own worth. Thank you for listening. Your worth isn't determined by the people who fail to see it. It's inherent, and nobody can ever take it away. The West Village townhouse is no longer a Lawson monument. It is a construction site for a future that doesn't belong to them. 2 weeks ago, I stood on the sidewalk as the final truck pulled away, carrying the last of the mahogany furniture and the heavy silk drapes that had served as the backdrop for my erasure. I watched my father Julian descend those limestone steps for the last time, his shoulders slumped and his hands empty. He didn't look back at the house and he didn't look at me. He just got into the modest car Elias had arranged and drove toward the PATH train. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. Looking back at the wreckage of the last few months, I realized that the $47 million checks or the senior partnerships weren't the real victory. The victory was the quietness that settled into my soul the moment I stopped asking for permission to take up space. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on this journey, and there are 5 lessons I've carried away from the ruins of the Lawson Empire. Labels are placeholders, not identities. My family spent years calling me a downgrade, and Elias a friend. Those weren't descriptions of us, they were descriptions of their own limited vision. Never let someone else's inability to see you define your worth. Success is the quietest form of revenge. You don't need to shout your achievements at people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Build your foundation in the shade and let the results speak when the sun finally shifts. Boundaries are not betrayals. Setting a boundary, whether it's a legal document or a blocked phone number, is an act of self-preservation. People who profit from your lack of boundaries will always call your self-respect cruelty. Utility is not the same as love. If your family only calls when they need staff or tech support, they aren't looking for a relationship, they are looking for a service. True family shows up for the birthday, not just the bailout. The golden child is often the biggest victim. Watching Chloe's collapse made me realize that being the favorite is just a different kind of cage. It requires a lifetime of performance that leaves you hollow when the audience finally leaves. Today, Elias and I have a new table. It isn't made of rare mahogany, and it doesn't sit in a room designed to intimidate guests. It's a simple table in a home filled with light set for two people who truly see each other. There are no folding chairs here, and no one is invisible. We don't talk about trajectories or pedigrees. We talk about the scholarship fund, the art we love, and the life we are building on our own terms. My parents still send the occasional message from Jersey City, but the words no longer have the power to sting. I've realized that I didn't need to break them to find my peace. I just needed to stop waiting for them to fix what they broke. I am Vivienne, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I belong. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the one left holding the coats while others move the world, I want you to know that your time is coming. Thank you for following my journey here on Hazel Tells Stories. Please like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories of resilience and role reversals. Remember, you define your worth, nobody else. Until next time.